Hello and welcome to H577, and today's lecture is the remarkable message of quantum physics. And what we are talking about is the remarkable complete overthrow of the Cartesian split. Only the fact that what we call the mental domain and the corporal domain has a connection or even is the same thing is something one haven't heard in the whole of philosophical history in Europe since pre-Socratic time. You cannot find a single thought in history, and not even one human being who could have thought anything such an absurdity. And it's this novelty that quantum physics brought that made Einstein himself turn around against his own invention, quantum physics, in the mid-war crisis. And he wanted, like all his predecessors, only to have two radically and completely independent domain. And this is a dogma that nobody in the whole history of thought ever would have fought against. We can go back to the Greek thought tradition, the pre-Socratic. By then already was established the split between the observer and the absurd. And that's something that stretched into the Christian church with all its varieties and church parts not believing in anything else but that the mind and the corporal spheres were independent and lacking any sort of connection in between. And of course, if you go into our different thought tradition when it comes to academic knowledge, until recently also in the science of cognition, but also in linguistics, mathematics, logic, psychology, sociology, anthropology, ethnology, and so forth. You will find in all these aspects of knowledge that a Cartesian split is in complete dominance. And this is despite that, for instance, when it comes to logic, the coherence and the correspondence was something that got overthrown by the German mathematician Gödel in the mid-war, and this is called Gödel's incomplete theorem. And here it was proven that mathematics never can be both consistent and coherent. And this is a very obvious pointer to the fact that the world is not in itself independent. And nothing can be proven by one domain alone. So what was proven by Gödel is that you cannot have two distinct, independent spheres of knowledge, and that nothing can be proved within one sphere by itself. Something very parallel happened in physics, and there you have had a very interesting relation between the founder of quantum physics, Einstein, and his disciple Pauli. And although Pauli accepted the possibility that the two spheres had something that they shared, or rather a new type of relationship called complementarity, Einstein was never able to accept that. And in the end, by the Copenhagen interpretation, Pauli was more or less silenced. And the same goes for the rest of the pioneers of quantum physics, like Schrödinger, Heisenberg, so forth. An interesting connection we find here in psychology, where we had Freud as more or less the inventor of modern Western psychology in the format of psychoanalysis, and his inheritor, the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, where in this case Freud refused to see the world having two parts with a connection in complementarity, and Jung did realize this and even had contact with the disciple of Einstein. And the same thing happened in this case. Freud, so to speak, won, and Jung became marginalized. And here, dear listener, you can see that all of what we today call education is completely and all dominated by the dualism. And also that this tendency in the last 2 centuries had gone increasingly fast. And a very good example of this is mathematics, where you, as late as the mid-19th century, had still a rather balanced view of mathematics, where you wouldn't accept there being numbers in eternity and there being real. But somewhere in the mid-19th century something happened, and you started to accept an independent reality to only one sphere. And I think that completely came with its breakthrough with the mathematician Cantor, who said that there are numbers that are beyond these numbers we can perceive or construct. And these numbers do have a reality of themselves. And also when we look to our corporal culture, it is 100% dualistic today. Everything that has to do with anything that is vaguely similar to thinking is completely absent when it comes to corporal culture and corporal training. The same you will find with all the political ideologies. They lack body, they lack all sorts of embodiment. They are corporal free, like spirits levitating above ground, never touching the ground, never touching reality, being in themselves, a little bit like the hope they had for mathematics in the beginning of the 20th century, coherent and consistent in itself, a full circle. When you go to all types of therapy in psychology and psychotherapy, they are all dualistic. We don't care about the body of the patients, neither in the body of the healer. The body is strikingly absent. And when you come to the different subjects of knowledge like physics, biology, sociology, chemistry, our thinking, the observer, the subject, does not have any role to play. To sum the whole thing up, what do we actually have today then? Well, for the first, what we think, no matter if it adheres to physics or philosophy or any other category of thought, what we have corporally doesn't seem to play any part in the quality of thinking or where the thinking is leading. Secondly, in all sorts of schooling, the subject, the content of all education is lacking the body, embodiment. It doesn't play a part. One doesn't care about the body, and one doesn't care about the body when it comes to even the construction of the edifices where schooling should take place. The body is screaming with absence, quietly. And for the third, when you come into psychology, we don't care about the body. The patients only have a psyche, a mentality. Its balance is coordination, how it's standing, how it's sitting, it doesn't matter. If the whole body is full of tension, that is completely a different sphere. Not something to be taken into consideration. And if you go to the psychotherapist or somebody other person that is so to speak is taking care of your soul, your body is not anything that person cares about. Your body will be put into a sofa and forgotten about, like some relative you don't want to hear about. For the fourth, the church, Christian church, is completely without a body. One has, by the time, removed the body in all the ceremonies in the church. The material is absent. Every sort of previous decoration one found in the church before Reformation, like icons, decorations, ceremonies, rituals. In all this, one has meticulously removed every trace of history, etymology, bodily expressions, everything material, everything needed to make anything complete and understandable, anything tangible. In the end, inside the church, we just have a sort of representation of something otherworldly, of something pointing to another world, but not something materially metaphorical, something perceived to be both material and spiritual. As you found before, when it came to the wine and the bread in the ceremony, where the bread was supposed to be the body of Christ and the wine the blood of Christ, both in material aspects and in spiritual aspects. It even gone so far that the Archbishop in Sweden said that all the religions have the same God. And this is a very clear conclusion, that God is just a representation, lacking of all tradition, all the different historical connections, the etymologies, and God is pure and only representation. Just like in the case of mathematics, just pointing to something that is real, but not real in itself. And there you have a very interesting connection between the ceremonies in the church, where the bread is purely representation of something you cannot see, feel, and doesn't have any sort of aspects you would call existence. The same goes for mathematics. The reality of the numbers is something otherworldly, something not in this domain. And this is typical for the paradoxes that is constructed by dualism. One can say there has always been an internal lack in dualism, and therefore it's constantly constructing something that doesn't exist. It is a little bit like a lonely child constructing imaginary friend. We have robbed everything connected to religion of its body. Everything is reduced to representations, and it's all looking the same. Somebody said that God is everywhere and nowhere. That the holy is everywhere and therefore nowhere. Every place is as holy as any other place. Therefore robbing the whole world of holiness, of the sacred. And when it comes to the churchly rituals and ceremonies, it has even gone so far that people today are saying and thinking that the ceremonies never, ever been something other than representations. They have never had a materiality. And I even heard people saying nobody for real believed that the bread and the wine actually was the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. Everybody in history have felt and thought it was purely representations. And I would say this is a bit too absurd. And this has been pointed out in the fantastic book, The Master and His Emissary. And this is the doing of the left hemisphere in the brain. That part of our thinking system that produces representations. Representations that by its function does not reach out in reality. It proves itself. It has a circular activity. And actually, exactly the same thing goes for the ceremonies, the rituals in the church today. They are true in by themselves. There is no need for any sort of redundant knickknacks, any hocus pocus in church. We have rid the church and our history and our rituals of all these dirty, real things. Everything now is like constructed by the left hemisphere, just pure representations. For the fifth, also in politics, we had made everything incorporeal. When you look at the parliament here in Sweden, all of the rituals that are supposed to instantiate, make our politics real, put it into a historical context, giving it a meaning, an etymology. One good example is the traditional opening of the parliament, where you used to have a group of drabants marching inside the Riksdag and giving politics as an activity some sort of historical reality. This has been removed together with the role of the king to open every year the parliament for a new season. Something that has been going on for more than 100 of years, and actually reach much further back in history. The drabants are actually instantiated already in the 17th century, and all these things has its roots deep in something bodily, material, tangible. something that people have felt, been doing, been acting out. Everything connected to what we will call the reality of action and doing. This was actually removed as late as in the 20th century. One wanted to rid all of democracy of all its embodiment, and the slogan was to purify democracy, to sterilize it against history, embodiment, and reality. It's not unfair to say that democracy in Sweden doesn't have any body at all today. It's pure representation. Even the actual house look ephemeral, and people are acting as they have no connection to history at all. And the further they sort of spit into the face of history, the better it is. Because today, democracy, liberty, and fraternity does not have any body, not history, and no time. And that makes it as unreal and schizophrenic, to use a harsh word, as mathematics. And this was already stated by the mathematician Bishop, who reacted in the mid of the last century against a mathematics that was not man-made or never constructed. Although there have been some reactions against the purification, the cultural revolution within Swedish democracy, nothing stood a chance. And I think it has been few countries in the world where as sudden the left hemisphere took over. Once it started in Sweden, it went really fast. And I have to mention, for instance, one of the subjects I've been studying myself, philosophy. In the beginning of the 20th century, in all the universities in Sweden, they voluntarily changed from continental philosophy to analytical philosophy within the span of a couple of years. This is really, really fast. I think few countries has gone through this sort of hastened cultural revolution, speeded up cultural revolution as Sweden. And you can visit every Swedish town in Sweden and you will see the effects of this purification of the material form of living, of ridding the cities of all buildings and all quarters. 65 to 70% of Stockholm was moved down by the machinery because it represented tradition and the old stuff. And even the oldest part of Stockholm, the oldest town construction in the whole of the Nordic countries, and one unique thing in the world, a UNESCO haven, was supposed to be made into a parking garage in the early 70s. And actually the slogan for doing this was "Get rid of history." It was seen as something bad. History was equal to lack of democracy, lack of fraternity, liberty, and equality. Thank God they didn't take away the old town. we would have lost one of the loveliest parts of the Nordic countries, I'd say. Nothing beats strolling through these old neighborhoods and get the smell, the touch, the feeling of olden age. They still stand to this day, thank God. For the sixth, within healthcare, it's been an explosion, especially the last decades, of ridding healthcare of every instantiation that it has something to do with human beings. It's no longer anything that has an etymology. All the private institutions had been state-owned today or owned by the different provinces. Everything should be centrally governed from Stockholm, the capital. Everything is ruled by the book. And it's even said today, in the olden times, they actually build the hospital out of people and traditions. And today we know better. These are things I heard when I grew up in the 70s, early 80s. This absolute belief that is very clearly shown by Ian McGilchrist is common from the left hemisphere. And its demand of ridding reality of all this instantiation from the material, ugly world. We've even gone so far in Sweden to attacking actually the food products. Already in the 18th century, we had this first pioneering tendency of acting in a dual way to reality. And one was the complete change of the Swedish countryside, where it was regulated from the capital that every part of Sweden, every acre, should be put into new areas to make the arable land solid, so to speak. Ridding it of the different demarcations that been going down since the Middle Ages, and making a new system where every piece of land was centralized around one farmyard instead of the different houses being collected in a village. And therefore, in almost all of Sweden, one took away the villages. So if you want to fly over the Nordic countries today, you can easily spot out Sweden, because that's the place where there are, even to this day, very few villages. The whole of the countryside was rid of the human beings. And in a couple of decades, they took away traditions, community, brotherhood that had been created for more than 2 millennia in Sweden. The whole of Sweden was completely castigated, and this tendency took its toll even on the food production, and it was eventually stopped because it went too far. And Sweden is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have any traditional cheese production, and this is because one thought that all cheese should be made centrally, and it should not be from tradition or history. Therefore, in Sweden to this day, we have newly constructed cheeses, like this instantiation of non-traditional cheese. All these different products were invented in the mid-war area, and all the cheeses that we produced before with strains of bacterium and mycelium that's been going on for centuries was taken away. Instead, one looked at a map in Stockholm and saw Or the cheese should be produced in the province, centrally in the province, always centrally. That didn't matter if there were mountains or lakes or anything in between. So therefore they collected all the milk to one dairy in the middle. And there they made new strains of cheese. Preferably cheeses that didn't have much taste, because they wanted the product to be uniform, universal, and not embodied. And actually there was a slogan there even, get rid of the traditional cheese. Because in that time already, traditional and history was something connected with evil, something bad. Cheese should have been made from nothing, and should be constructed from nothing. And I particularly like something called hushållsost, the most common cheese today. And I think one of the few cheeses that lack anything of substance to it. Doesn't really have any taste. It doesn't have texture. It hardly even has holes. It's a bit like the new mathematics or the political system in Sweden. It doesn't have any feel to it. Doesn't have any tangible stuff. It doesn't have any of the off flavors. It's purely a chemical product. It's pure representation. Or as one could say in logic, it is true by itself, self-subservient, with no need of anything other or anything material. And here I think I end the lecture about the remarkable message from quantum physics. The remarkable message that we somewhere in history went astray and we lost our lead, we lost our balance, our foothold. And actually the message that we had gone astray actually came from physics itself. And I think that's the oddest thing, is that physics always has been supposed to be the most stricted, the most immaterial subject, the most clearest, enlightened subject. But still, the most important message came from physics and from nowhere else. Isn't that strange? And try to take that message to your heart. I say you thank you very much, and I bid you farewell from this lecture.